Nepal in September looked like a postcard of peace. The snow-covered peaks of the Himalayas glistened under the autumn sun, prayer flags fluttered in the mountain breeze, and rivers carved their way through ancient valleys. In the streets of Kathmandu, life moved in familiar rhythms. The shopkeepers of Asan Bazaar shouted prices of fresh vegetables, children in neat uniforms weaved through alleys on their way to school, and pilgrims circled the great Baudhanath stupa, spinning prayer wheels that whispered centuries of devotion. To an outsider, Nepal seemed timeless, unchanged, untouched, serene. But beneath the beauty, the nation carried invisible weight. Every conversation in a tea shop, every late-night talk among students, every quiet sigh of a taxi driver carried the same message: things were not right. The young especially felt this burden. They were the generation born after civil war, raised with the promise of democracy, told that a better Nepal awaited them. Yet, as they grew, so did their disappointments. Jobs were scarce, corruption was everywhere, and leaders seemed more concerned with power games than with people. Many had family abroad, sending remittances that kept households alive. Some dreamed of leaving Nepal themselves, believing opportunity lived only outside its borders. And yet, in the digital world, they found hope. Social media had become more than entertainment. It was their stage, their microphone, their mirror. On TikTok they created, on Instagram they shared, on Twitter they questioned authority, and on Facebook they united. It was in those digital spaces that their frustrations turned into movements, their loneliness turned into community, and their silence turned into noise. But all storms begin in silence. Beneath the chanting monks and the buzzing markets, a storm was forming. The youth of Nepal were restless. Their hearts were heavy with broken promises. Their minds were full of ideas for a better tomorrow. Their voices, though not yet loud in the streets, were already roaring in the digital world. They did not yet know it, but the spark that would change everything was just days away. The storm clouds were gathering. And Nepal, the land of mountains and dreams, was about to enter one of the most turbulent chapters of its history. In the early days of September 2025, Nepal's streets looked as they always did, shops opening slowly in the misty mornings, the smell of fresh tea drifting from roadside stalls, buses honking as they squeezed through the narrow lanes of Kathmandu. On the surface, life appeared ordinary. But inside people's phones, in the digital world where millions of young Nepalis spent their evenings, something extraordinary was about to collapse. On September 4th, the government made an announcement that stunned the nation. 26 social media platforms were banned overnight. TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, X, and even smaller local apps all silenced in one sweeping decree. The official explanation was polished and diplomatic: to control misinformation, protect national security, and maintain peace. But everyone knew what it really meant. The ban was not about safety, it was about control. For Nepal's ruling elite, social media had become too dangerous. Every corruption scandal, every broken promise, every arrogant remark from a politician was exposed instantly by young people online. Memes cut deeper than speeches, and TikTok videos spread faster than propaganda. The government, used to silence and obedience, suddenly found itself mocked, criticized, and questioned by a generation it didn't understand. For leaders who valued control above all else, the easiest solution seemed simple: shut the voices down. But here's where they miscalculated. To Gen Z Nepalis, social media was not just a pastime. It was their voice, their diary, their community, their protest wall, and their stage. Many of them grew up in small towns or villages where opportunities were scarce, but through their phones, they felt connected to the world. They learned skills on YouTube, built small businesses through Facebook, became storytellers on TikTok, and earned side incomes through Instagram. For some, social media was not just fun, it was survival. To ban it overnight was not just inconvenient. It was suffocating. The reaction was immediate. Students in Kathmandu who had just finished classes returned to their dorms only to find their apps gone. In Pokhara, cafe owners who promoted their businesses online panicked about losing customers. In rural areas, children who used TikTok for fun couldn't understand why everything had gone dark. And across the country, anger swelled, not quiet anger, but a shared fury that crossed class, gender, and geography. Within hours, VPN downloads spiked as youth tried to bypass restrictions. Memes were created mocking the government, ministers drawn as old dinosaurs holding giant scissors cutting internet cables, or politicians shown hiding under desks from the power of TikTok videos. What the government wanted to bury became louder, sharper, and more creative. The ban also struck at a wound that was already bleeding: joblessness and hopelessness. Nepal's youth had long suffered from high unemployment. Every year, thousands left the country to work in Gulf states or Malaysia, sending money home because there were too few opportunities within their own borders. Social media had become an alternative. Some earned money as influencers, digital freelancers, or online entrepreneurs. By banning it, the government wasn't just silencing criticism, it was crushing livelihoods. And then came the boiling point. On campuses, whispers turned into debates, and debates into calls for action. If they can take away our voice today, what will they take tomorrow? Students asked. If we stay silent, we lose everything. Slowly, online frustration transformed into offline determination. By evening, in Kathmandu's Tamil district, the first small group of protesters appeared. They held no weapons, only placards scribbled in urgency: "We need freedom, not censorship." Police pushed them back, thinking it was nothing serious. But the next day, hundreds came. Then thousands. And within the week, the protests had spread to nearly every major city. The government had thought the ban would silence the youth. Instead, it gave them a cause to unite under, a banner to march with, and a reason to rise. Nepal had been quiet for too long, but on that September day, a sleeping generation found its roar. The spark had been struck, and the fire of resistance had only begun to burn. The first week after the ban was like the moment before a storm. Nepal's skies looked the same: clouds drifting lazily over the Himalayas, life moving at its ordinary pace, but the streets below were filling with tension. What began as whispers in university cafeterias and late-night hostile conversations was now turning into a movement too big to contain. At first, it was just students, brave, restless, unwilling to be silent. They gathered outside Tribhuvan University in Kathmandu, carrying handmade signs. Some read, "Unban our voices," others said, "Democracy means freedom." They were young, some barely in their 20s, wearing backpacks instead of armor, chanting slogans with shaky voices that grew stronger as the crowd swelled. By the second day, they weren't alone. Shopkeepers joined in, their businesses hurt by the loss of online promotion. Teachers came, angry that communication with students had been disrupted. Even taxi drivers, often ignored in political movements, honked their horns in rhythm with the chants. What started as a protest about social media had transformed into something far greater: a demand for dignity, justice, and a government that respected its people. Kathmandu's streets became rivers of humanity. Banners waved high above the crowds, fluttering against the backdrop of ancient temples and modern billboards. "Corruption down, freedom up," they shouted. "We are the future," echoed in every direction. The sound was not just noise, it was a heartbeat, steady and strong, pulsing through the veins of the capital city. From Tamil to Ratna Park, the protests spread like fire. In Pokhara, young people gathered by Fewer Lake, their reflections merging with the water as they raised fists to the sky. In Biratnagar, thousands blocked highways, their chants rolling across the plains. Even in small villages, people marched with whatever they could carry: sticks, flags, or even musical instruments, turning their protests into both defiance and celebration. The police tried at first to disperse them, thinking the crowds would tire. Lines of officers with shields and helmets pushed forward, but the youth didn't retreat. Instead, they linked arms, stood firm, and sang songs of unity. It wasn't violence that fueled them, it was courage. And in those moments, generations that had lived in silence finally saw their children stand tall. Social media might have been banned, but the protests found their own rhythm. Artists painted murals overnight, giant fists breaking chains, doves flying over the tricolour flag of Nepal. Poets recited verses in the middle of the streets, their words echoing louder than megaphones. Musicians brought guitars and maduls, turning chants into anthems. The movement was no longer only political, it was cultural, spiritual, and deeply human. Every protest carried stories. A young woman from Pokhara marched with a placard saying, "My brother died in the Gulf for lack of jobs. Don't silence me too." A middle-aged man carried his small daughter on his shoulders, telling her, "Remember this day. This is history." The youth were leading, but the nation was following. Day by day, the movement grew. By the end of the first week, Kathmandu was not just a city of temples and traffic, it was a city of voices rising in unison. Drone shots from international media showed seas of people filling Durbar Marg and Matigar Mandala. What looked like chaos was, in fact, unity. And what looked like noise was, in fact, truth. The world began to take notice. International outlets reported Nepal's youth rise against censorship. Human rights organizations condemned the ban. Embassies quietly watched. For the first time in years, Nepal's struggle wasn't hidden, it was on the global stage. The government had thought the ban would keep order. Instead, it ignited the largest youth-led uprising the country had seen in decades. A simple decree meant to silence had awakened a generation that refused to go back to sleep. The streets of Nepal were alive, and the roar of its people was unstoppable. The chants of thousands echoed across Kathmandu like rolling thunder: freedom, justice, our voice. 4 days, the government had watched uneasily from behind the high walls of Singha Durbar, the seat of power. Ministers met in hurried sessions, their voices raised, their faces pale with fear. They had expected the youth to protest for a day or two, then scatter back to classrooms, tea shops, and quiet lives. But now, the protests were spreading from city to city, filling highways, markets, and public squares. The ruling elite felt the ground trembling beneath their feet. To them, the movement was not just about social media, it was a direct challenge to their authority. They decided to do what every insecure government does when threatened: they chose force. On the morning of the 5th day, Kathmandu woke not to birdsong but to the heavy boots of riot police. Trucks rolled into the city, unloading men in dark uniforms with shields, batons, and helmets. Tear gas canisters clinked in their belts. Orders had been given: restore order at any cost. At Ratna Park, where protesters had gathered since dawn, the standoff began. Students carried signs, guitars, and flags. Police carried shields, guns, and fear. For a moment, both sides simply stared at one another, the young faces filled with fire, the older faces hidden behind plastic shields. Then came the first crack. A canister was fired, hissing as it arched into the crowd. Smoke exploded, burning throats and stinging eyes. Panic rippled through the protesters, but they didn't run. They covered their faces with scarves, poured water over their eyes, and raised their fists higher. The chants grew louder: "We will not bow. We will not break." Clashes erupted across the city. Batons swung, shields smashed, and stones flew back in defiance. The narrow streets of Asan and Indra Chowk turned into battlegrounds. Tear gas hung heavy like a ghost, clinging to walls and windows, choking even the bystanders who had not come to protest. Shops closed their shutters, but from the gaps, eyes peeked out, watching history unfold. In Pokhara, by the lakeside, police charged into crowds with sticks raised. In Biratnagar, water cannons blasted protesters, drenching both young and old. Videos leaked despite the ban, showing brutal beatings, blooded students, and women dragged across pavements. The government had hoped violence would scare the youth into silence, but every blow only lit the fire stronger. By nightfall, Kathmandu's streets were glowing not with festival lights, but with burning tires. Protesters lit flames at crossroads, not to celebrate, but to resist. Their songs turned into cries, their banners into shields. The government had unleashed its power, but in doing so, it had revealed its fear. Parents wept as they watched their children return home bruised and bleeding. Yet those same children wiped their wounds, stood again, and returned to the streets the next morning. Courage became contagious. A girl, no older than 18, stood on a police barricade shouting, "You can beat us, but you cannot silence us." Her words spread like wildfire. The battle lines were drawn. On one side stood a government clinging to power with batons and bullets. On the other stood a generation armed only with courage and conviction. And somewhere in the smoky air above Kathmandu, a realization settled like dust. The protests were no longer about apps, bans, or censorship. They had transformed into a fight for the soul of Nepal. The government had struck back. But instead of breaking the people, it had awakened them fully. Courage is never free. Every chant shouted in defiance, every step taken against the barricades, carried a cost. By the second week of protests, Nepal's streets were no longer just filled with chants and banners, they were stained with blood. The clashes between police and protesters grew fiercer with each passing day. At first, rubber bullets and tear gas dominated the confrontations. But then, as crowds refused to disperse, live rounds were fired. What was once a standoff turned into tragedy. The first deaths hit the nation like a thunderclap. A 19-year-old boy in Kathmandu, struck in the chest. A young girl in Pokhara, caught between fleeing crowds. A policeman in Biratnagar, crushed by stones and chaos. The numbers climbed with heartbreaking speed. By the end of the week, at least 51 lives had been lost. And suddenly, the protests were no longer just about freedom of speech. They became about justice for the dead. Families wept in the narrow alleys of Kathmandu as white funeral cloths wrapped the bodies of their children. Mothers wailed, fathers stood silent in shock, siblings clutched photographs that already looked like relics of another life. Streets that once echoed with chants now carried the sound of grief. Yet, even in mourning, the people refused to stop. Candles appeared across the cities, lined along pavements, on temple steps, beside the Bagmati River. Names of the fallen spread secretly through leaflets and whispered conversations. Ramesh, 22. Sita, 19. Prakosh, 20. They became more than individuals. They became martyrs. Artists painted their faces on cracked walls. Poets recited verses dedicated to their courage. Folk singers turned their stories into ballads, sung in the evenings as people gathered to honor them. Each death, instead of silencing the movement, breathed new life into it. In Kathmandu's Basantapa Square, thousands gathered for a vigil. The night air was heavy with incense and smoke. A mother stepped onto the stage, her son's photograph pressed to her chest. Her voice broke as she cried, "My son wanted only a future. They gave him death. Do not let his sacrifice be in vain." The crowd erupted not in anger, but in solemn determination. They lit candles, raised them high, and sang the national anthem with tears streaming down their faces. The government called the protesters violent. But people saw the truth with their own eyes. Unarmed youth facing bullets, students carrying books instead of guns, daughters, and sons falling with nothing in their hands but placards. The narrative of law and order crumbled against the raw reality of grieving families. Even the international community could not stay silent. Human rights organizations condemned the killings. News outlets carried images of smoke-filled streets, blooded shirts, and mothers collapsing at funerals. The world was watching, and the government of Nepal was cornered. But for the people inside Nepal, the cost was deeply personal. Every death was a hole in a family. Every injured protester was a reminder of the cruelty of power. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded, broken bones, head injuries, tear gas burns. Volunteers formed human chains to carry the injured to safety, turning protests into acts of solidarity as much as defiance. The youth understood something profound: revolutions are not measured by the number of chants, but by the number of sacrifices. And they were willing to bear it. The price of defiance had been paid in blood. But that blood had watered the soil of Nepal with a new seed, the unshakable belief that their struggle was no longer a choice, it was destiny. The question was no longer should we fight. The question had become how far are we willing to go. For weeks, Nepal had burned not with fire alone, but with anger, grief, and defiance. Every chant shouted in the streets, every candle lit at a vigil, every funeral held for a fallen youth chipped away at the legitimacy of those in power. The government, once confident in its authority, was now crumbling under the weight of its own decisions. Inside Singha Durbar, the grand complex of Nepal's central government, tension hung thick in the air. Meetings stretched into the night. Ministers shouted over one another, their voices laced with panic. Reports from across the country painted the same picture: protests growing, casualties mounting, international condemnation rising. What began as a simple ban had unleashed a storm too powerful to control. Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli, a man who once stood tall with political cunning and arrogance, now found himself cornered. His speeches on national security sounded hollow against the images of dead students wrapped in white cloth. His promises of stability rang false against the chaos in the streets. The people no longer saw him as a leader, they saw him as the cause of their suffering. Every day, pressure grew heavier. Opposition parties seized the moment, calling him a dictator. Civil society leaders demanded his resignation. Even allies within his own circle whispered betrayal, sensing that his fall was inevitable. And then came the final blow. In Kathmandu, tens of thousands filled Maitigar Mandala, the symbolic heart of protest. They marched not just with placards but with photographs of the dead. The chants this time were not only for freedom, they were for justice. The roar of the crowd was deafening, echoing off the walls of the capital. Oli resign! Oli resign! The sound reached the ears of the Prime Minister himself. Inside his heavily guarded residence, the once unshakable leader sat in silence, staring at television screens showing seas of protesters. For years he had ruled with confidence, mocking critics and dismissing opposition. But now, that same man sat with his shoulders heavy, his face pale, and his legacy dissolving before his eyes. On September 12, 2025, the inevitable happened. KP Sharma Oli tendered his resignation. His letter, though carefully worded, could not hide the truth. He was stepping down not out of choice, but out of defeat. News spread like wildfire. From the crowded streets of Kathmandu to the quiet valleys of Mustang, people erupted in celebration. Bells rang in temples, car horns blared, and protesters hugged one another, tears of exhaustion and relief streaming down their faces. The chants shifted from anger to triumph. We did it, the people have won. But the celebrations were bittersweet. For many, joy was mixed with grief. Parents who had lost their children held their photographs close, whispering, "Your sacrifice was not in vain." Martyrs had not lived to see this victory, but their blood had written the path to it. Ollie's fall was not just the resignation of one man. It was the collapse of arrogance, the crumbling of a wall that had stood between the people and their power. It was proof that even the mightiest rulers cannot stand against a united generation willing to risk everything. Yet with his resignation came a haunting question: what next? The government was headless, the nation was wounded, and the people were restless. Power had collapsed, but a vacuum had opened. Into that vacuum, something or someone would have to step. For the first time in weeks, the streets of Nepal were quiet. Not with fear, but with anticipation. A storm had passed, but the future remained uncertain. Nepal had toppled its leader. Now it had to decide what kind of nation it wanted to become. When KP Sharma Oli resigned, Nepal stood at a crossroads. The throne of leadership was empty, and the air was heavy with uncertainty. People had marched, bled, and lost loved ones to bring down a ruler, but who would guide them now? The answer came in a name that carried weight not of politics, but of integrity: Sushila Karki. A former Chief Justice of Nepal's Supreme Court, she had once been known for her fierce independence, her unshakable honesty, and her refusal to bow before power. Now, she was chosen as the interim Prime Minister, becoming the first woman to ever lead Nepal's government. When the announcement was made, reactions rippled across the nation. Some cheered, seeing her as a symbol of hope and justice. Others were cautious, unsure if one leader could heal so many wounds. But for the youth who had filled the streets, her face offered something rare: trust. Unlike seasoned politicians, she carried no history of corruption, no baggage of broken promises. She was not a career player in the dirty game of power, she was an outsider stepping into the storm. Her task was enormous: calm a grieving nation, restore stability, and prepare for elections. But her presence alone carried meaning. For the first time in Nepal's history, a woman stood at the top, not through dynasty, not through inheritance, but through merit and resilience. In villages, mothers whispered to daughters, "Look, it is possible." In cities, protesters raised banners with her image, calling her the face of a new beginning. It was not the end of Nepal's struggle. But it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where the voice of the people had the power to lift not just governments, but symbols of justice and change. With Sushila Karki as interim Prime Minister, Nepal entered a fragile but hopeful moment. The streets, once filled with tear gas and fire, began to quiet. But beneath the silence lay a question that echoed across the nation: what comes next? The answer was elections. On March 5, 2026, Nepal would go to the polls to choose a new government. It was a date etched into the minds of millions, an opportunity to turn sacrifice into change, to transform protests into policy. Until then, Karki's interim government had one mission: stabilize the country and prepare the ground for a fair, transparent vote. But the road was not simple. The wounds of September still bled. Families mourned their children, hospitals cared for the injured, and businesses struggled after weeks of shutdowns. Trust in politicians was shattered. Many asked, would this election bring real change, or would it be the same cycle of corruption with new faces? Youth groups, once protesters in the streets, now organized campaigns, debates, and awareness drives. This time, they said, we will not just shout, we will choose. For them, the ballot was the continuation of the struggle, not the end of it. Across the nation, conversations shifted. In tea shops, farmers spoke of jobs and fair wages. In classrooms, students discussed technology and freedom. In crowded buses, workers argued over parties and promises. The election was not just about politics, it was about the kind of Nepal people wanted to build. The interim period was like a pause before a storm. Calm on the surface, but filled with anticipation. Everyone knew, the sacrifices of September would only matter if March became the beginning of something new. Away from rallies and speeches, Life in Nepal carried its own battles. Prices of food and fuel climbed, jobs were scarce, and families depended heavily on money sent home by loved ones working abroad. In the hills, landslides and floods tested villages every monsoon, while in the plains farmers prayed for steady rains. And yet, the people endured. Mothers managed homes with little, youths tried to build small businesses, and teachers kept hope alive in classrooms with few resources. Their struggles were not loud, but they were the heartbeat of the nation, reminding everyone that politics alone could never define Nepal. When elections finally drew near, something had already changed. The youth who once filled streets with protest now filled classrooms, tea shops, and town halls with debates. They spoke not only of anger, but of vision, jobs, justice, dignity, and dreams of a stronger Nepal. For the first time in years, people began to believe that their voices mattered. And though the road ahead was uncertain, the spirit of a generation had awakened, ready to shape Nepal's tomorrow.